This video is brought to you by PPL IR Europe, a not-for-profit community of European general aviation pilots dedicated to helping ourselves and others to use our licenses to the full. We share our passion for flying through mutual exchange of expertise, experience, information, inspiration, and education. We also assist regulators in framing legislation that affects all GA pilots. We're almost all volunteers and do it because we love it, though we do also need to raise a little money, mainly to fund our representation and lobby activities. Please join us, improve and broaden your own flying, enjoy belonging to a community of like-minded pilots, and help us represent you. Hi, this is the third video in the series I'm making about basic instrument skills and is about holding. But, like my other videos, it's absolutely not the received wisdom about holding, where people over the years have come up with amazing but completely incomprehensible and unmemorable formulae for calculating holds using gates and all sorts. My aim here is to tell you how to hold in a safe and acceptable way that will also be good enough to get you through the IR skills test, but without the intellectual rigor that some elements of the training industry would like to see applied, to my mind, quite unnecessarily. First, let's talk about why we hold. There are three main reasons. Firstly, for traffic separation and sequencing. That is common for big jets going into major airports, or at least it was before the COVID-related collapse in volumes, but is relatively unusual for our kinds of aircraft. The usual range of Cessna 172 to Navajo going into regional airports and GA airfields. It happens, I'm told, but I simply can't remember the last time it happened to me, if ever. I certainly held in jets going into Heathrow in the early 90s, 30 years ago, but I can't remember doing so in a light aircraft since. The second reason is because the weather or runway is unsuitable for landing, and you're either waiting for an improvement or working out where to divert. If you have any sense, while you're waiting for an improvement, you're also looking at your diversion options. And the third reason is because you have technical issues, typically gear or avionics, you need to resolve before you land. The point about weather and technical cases is that you need to dedicate your thinking power to the matter in hand, not to the finesse of holding. Of course, if you have modern avionics with air data computer and autopilot with roll steering, you just leave the aircraft to its own devices. But equally, you're probably not watching this video. This video is about being able to hand fly or fly on a heading mode a reasonable hold while spending most of your effort on other things. It covers single needle holds on NDBs, VOR, localizer DME, and GNSS holds. The principles are much the same, but they each bring their own challenges. I will refer to the holding fix, rather than the beacon, throughout, to emphasize that the technique is the same regardless of whether you are flying NDB, VOR, or GNSS. I'll also cover hold joins and how best to use them to get the information you need to make the rest of the hold go well. The two main things you need to do are to maintain an accurate altitude and to remain in the protected area of the hold. Altitude is really important. If you're in the hold, there's every chance that either other aircraft will also be there with you, or they'll be passing underneath you in the instrument procedure. Separation is normally 1,000 feet. If you're carrying passengers, it might be worth mentioning before it happens that big aircraft can seem very close. You might think that if you descend by 200 feet, even if the aircraft below climbed accidentally by 200 feet, there is still plenty of room for error. But it's not that simple. If an aircraft below you has TCAS, as most business aircraft do, then seeing you descend by 200 feet when only 1,000 feet above may trigger an RA, a resolution advisory, which the crew of the other aircraft are obliged to follow. That can cause all sorts of confusion and risk, as the other crew may well be operating in contradiction to ATC instructions. You've caused mayhem by descending unexpectedly. Remaining in the protected part of the hold is less of an issue for us, as it's usually set for aircraft much faster than ourselves, and therefore occupying much more space. Protection is about keeping aircraft away from both other traffic and terrain, but provided you're on the right side of the axis and don't go wildly wrong, is unlikely to be a problem. There are four legs of the hold: the outbound turn, the outbound leg, the inbound turn, and the inbound leg. In an ideal world, they each occupy 1 minute, meaning that the hold takes 4 minutes and indeed is often referred to as a 4-minute hold. Back in Ernest Gann's day, people used to really obsess about being back over the holding fix exactly every 4 minutes, so that the procedural controller could be sure when the aircraft would be in a position to go outbound in the procedure. But these days, anywhere which is so busy as to have stacks of aircraft in the hold will have radar, and the 4 minutes has become less of an issue. The wind affects all 4 legs and must be corrected for. However, the 2 turns are flown at rate 1 and therefore cannot contain any wind correction. They might be elongated or foreshortened by the wind in both axes of the hold, but they are flown at rate 1 and are 180-degree turns and therefore last 1 minute, so there's no room for correction of either track or timing. The 2 straight legs can be corrected, but it's important that the inbound leg is tracked accurately so that the aircraft arrives at the holding fix stably pointing in the right direction to go outbound in the procedure or the next time around the hold. The wind affecting the inbound leg is dealt with on that leg, both in terms of drift and timing. But we don't have the space and time to deal with the effects of wind on the other 3 legs once we're on the inbound leg. So we've established that the effect of wind on the 2 turns and the outbound leg cannot be dealt with within the turns nor on the inbound leg. That leaves only 1 leg to deal with the effects of wind on the outbound turn, the outbound leg, and the inbound turn, and that's the outbound leg. Another way to think about this is that the air mass will move a certain amount each minute. In a 30-knot wind, the aircraft will be displaced half a nautical mile every minute. There's nothing we can do about that displacement in the first and third minutes, so we are left with the task of correcting for 1.5 miles of displacement in the second minute, the outbound leg. So, if the displacement from minutes 1, 2, and 3 all need dealing with in minute 2, it's obvious that whatever we do in minute 2 must be 3 times the correction required for that leg. That's why we multiply the drift by 3 and add or subtract 3 times the timing. It should now be obvious. If not, rewind and look at the last couple of minutes again until the penny drops. Incidentally, it's not always clear to pilots that they're not trying to fly the neat lozenge depicted on the plates. If there's any wind, that is not possible. The actual track on the ground will be distorted into a shape like these. There are 2 ways of determining what the corrections on the outbound leg should be. One of them, most commonly used on test, is to use the forecast wind to calculate the single drift and timing, to multiply it by 3 and apply that. So, a quick work example. We have a right-hand hold with an inbound track of 270. The wind is 045 degrees at 25 knots. We are flying at 120 knots. We can calculate the single drift as 8 degrees and the ground speed on the outbound leg as minus 16 knots or 8 seconds of flight time. Thus, the outbound heading must be 3 times 8 equals 24 degrees, to the left of 090 or 066 degrees, and the timing must be 1 minute plus 3 lots of 8, so 1 minute 24 seconds. If you fly that outbound leg of 066 degrees for 1 minute 24 seconds and fly accurate rate 1 turns, you're pretty much guaranteed to execute a neat, accurate hold. But, I hear you saying to yourself, that's all very well if I have 5 minutes in the quiet of a briefing room with a calculator or whiz wheel, and then I get exactly the hold I was expecting and the wind is exactly as forecast. But what happens if the hold turns out to be at a higher level where the wind is different, or they change the runway, or I get told to make a different hold? All my calculations have gone out of the window, and I need to find a way to deal with the hold without all the maths. And that is also true of any hold you have to do after you've passed your test. To some extent, those with an air data computer are assisted by knowing what the wind is in their location and at their altitude. But though it helps you guess at drift and timing, you're still having to operate a mental whiz wheel, something that not a lot of pilots are great at. But, as I said before, if you have an air data computer and modern avionics, it is able to work out the whole hold for you. So you can just follow the magenta line all the way around, and many of the techniques in this video are not really for you. But before you hurry away, let's just check that you know that with a lot of modern GNSS equipment, you can easily set up a hold to your specification on any waypoint, which includes waypoints with a published hold which has not been coded into the Jefferson database, of which there are quite a few. For example, at Cambridge, there's a published hold at Charlie Alpha Mike, but it doesn't appear in the waypoint list. But you can add the hold at the waypoint by entering the inbound course and the direction of the hold. And it now appears on the flight plan and behaves just the same as a hold in the database. You can also use this technique to create an en route hold, or just to set up a hold outside controlled airspace if you've been asked to remain outside the circuit or ATZ. It's better than flying orbits as it will not be moved by the wind. Now, before going off on a tangent talking about holds managed by the GNSS, I was saying that we usually don't have the time, capacity, or sometimes the wind information to formally plan a hold. So I teach the other way to fly the hold, based not on calculations, but on experimental results. We need to know the single drift and longitudinal timing to determine our outbound heading and time. So let's start with the drift. The first thing to say is that even if you're single needle holding, which normally means NDB-ADF, and you have an HSI, whether mechanical or glass, line up the HSI with the axis of the hold. This gives you a beautiful orientation aid, as well as allowing you to visualize drift, see when you're abeam, and when you are established on the inbound track. If you're using VOR or GNSS, then the beam bar is still set to the inbound leg and left there. If you're holding at a GNSS waypoint where the inbound track is not a flight plan leg, then you should use the OBS function. In most installations, you press the OBS button, then turn the CDI or HSI to the inbound track of the hold. Even if you have an auto-slew EHSI, pressing the OBS button on the GNSS will interrupt auto-slew and enable you to turn the track pointer. You can now use the GNSS waypoint as if it were a VOR with the inbound track set. Whether you're using a VOR or GNSS waypoint, you should leave the pointer on the inbound track throughout the hold. In order to determine drift, we need to have a little time on the axis tracking towards or away from the fix. We use the hold join to create that opportunity. There are three ways to join the hold: direct, parallel, and teardrop, and they all offer the opportunity to measure that single drift if we fly them correctly. Which join you use is determined by this diagram. If we stick with a hold with an inbound track of 270 degrees, then if your inbound track is between 200 and 020 degrees, you make a direct join. Between 020 and 090 degrees, it's a teardrop, and between 090 and 200 degrees, it's the parallel join. Visualizing which join is required has always been a little difficult. First thing to say is that you don't need to be precise. There are a number of ways to visualize which join to use. One is the thumb method, which is described in numerous YouTube videos, and if it floats your boat, that's fine. Or you can look at the JEP or AIP plate and draw on it. But I prefer a simpler method of putting a pen or pencil on the DI and overlaying an imaginary hold, which allows you very quickly to determine which join to use. Start by putting the pencil on the DI, pointing at the middle from the direction of the inbound track. Now mentally overlay the join pattern right or left, and the sector dividing lines. The aircraft symbol can be seen flying through the holding fix. Now you can easily see in your mind's eye which sector you're joining from, and therefore the correct join. In this case, it's a direct join because the aircraft is pointing into the big sector. Now the aircraft is pointing into the medium-sized parallel join sector, and in this one, into the smallest teardrop entry. If you have an HSI, you don't need a pencil because, as I said a minute ago, you set the beam bar on the axis, so you just use that to overlay your mental map. If you have an EHSI, then in all likelihood you'll have a picture of the hold on the EHSI, the MFD, or the GNSS to orientate yourself. If you find it difficult to remember which sector is which, you can be cantankerous like me and remember that fate and Murphy's Law never smile on us. The hardest join, the direct join, is the most likely, occupying the biggest sector. I'll explain in a minute why it is the hardest. The second hardest, the parallel, occupies the medium-sized sector. The easiest, as the fates would have it, is the least likely, occupying the smallest sector. That's just my fatalistic way of remembering it. You can probably develop an aide-memoire which suits better your own outlook. Many students start by thinking that the direct join, which is statistically the most likely as it accounts for half of all the inbound tracks, is the easiest. It's not. It is the most difficult because you have no basis for any of your timing, nor any fixed point to turn outbound. The outbound turn is not a 1 minute turn. It could be anything from 23 seconds to 1 minute 23 seconds. And if you're approaching from the hold side, you spend the first 23 seconds flying in the wrong direction, bringing the outbound leg much closer into the inbound leg. In a strong wind from the hold side, this can result in you actually ending up on the wrong side of the holding fix. It's a real mess, and this brings me on to the first two of my cheats. If you conclude your way out of doing a direct join and into either a parallel or teardrop, do so. In real life, this is no issue. You simply adjust your track slightly as you approach the fix, such that you arrive at the fix from either the parallel or teardrop sectors. There's no one there to tell you you're cheating. If you're on test, I'd simply tell the examiner that's what you're doing. The direct join is going to be messy from this angle. I'm going to adjust my heading to give us a nice, neat parallel or teardrop join, sir. Or, if your track is too far from the sector dividing line, conclude it the other way by arranging to arrive at the fix on the inbound track with a neat bit of anticipation. Again, on test, explaining yourself briefly and long enough in advance such that the examiner knows it's your intention, not an accident. Thus, you've achieved your goal of either avoiding the direct join or arranging that it arrives at the fix pointing in the right direction, which both allows you to measure the single drift and to be entering a 180-degree outbound turn from the right direction. So that's how you get to measure the single drift if you have to do a direct join. It's obvious that on a teardrop entry, where you track outbound 30 degrees into the hold, then turn and intercept the inbound track, that you have a nice long inbound leg to determine the single drift. However, you do need to use double drift outbound to compensate for the inbound turn. So if you find that you need to fly 055 degrees to maintain the 060 degree outbound track, turn a further 5 degrees into the wind, so 050 degrees, just to make sure that you establish inbound as neatly as possible. But statistically, only 20% of joins are teardrop. You're more likely to be doing a parallel join, and we have to find a way of still getting the single drift on that procedure. There are two ways to do a parallel join, the easy way and the recommended way. The easy way is to fly outbound and make the turn and then go straight back to the fix. You can measure the single drift outbound. This is easiest done by thinking of it as coming from a cardinal point. So remembering I have to turn 8 degrees towards the north rather than doing any calculations. But the downside is that you arrive at the holding fix pointing in the wrong direction with an extra 30 degrees to turn, thus messing up your timings and your distance from the axis. So the generally accepted way of doing it is to turn 270 degrees on the inbound turn, then to immediately reverse the turn and establish a 45-degree intercept heading. These figures don't need to be precise and depend on wind and airspeed. You just want to ensure that you're pointing in the right direction with the drift from the outbound leg applied. So, whatever join you've used, you now have the single drift. With the most common direct join, you have achieved it by anticipating the inbound track. With the second most likely parallel join, you've measured it outbound. And on the least likely but easiest teardrop join, you've measured it inbound. How you measure the single drift depends on the type of equipment you have and the radio aids you're using. With an EHSI, it's super easy. You use the course pointer or track indicator to stay on the track and just read off the heading. In this case, the drift is 9 degrees. With a mechanical HSI set to the inbound track, i.e. on a VOR or GNSS track, you can just read off the difference between the heading and track, again 9 degrees here. Or you can read it off the GNSS directly. This is showing 3 degrees. On a DJI and OBS, you can only compare the heading with the selected course, 10 degrees in this case. On the RMI and RBI, you can read it straight off. Here the needle is 6 degrees to the right of the nose on the RMI and 8 degrees to the left on the RBI. Now that you have the single drift, you can multiply it by 3 and apply it outbound. The other thing we need to work out experimentally is the outbound timing. Remember how I said that this is all about the wind affecting all four legs equally? Well, we use that to our advantage when calculating timing. In the outbound turn, if flown accurately at rate 1, the time taken to turn 180 degrees must be 1 minute. If the end of that turn ends up displaced from being a beam the holding fix, then that displacement must be, by definition, the effect of wind in 1 minute. In this diagram, the wind is blowing the aircraft out of the hold, and here into the hold. We simply start the timing as we leave the holding fix, then determine the time taken to go abeam the holding fix. In the first example, it's 10 seconds less than a minute. In the second example, it's 10 seconds more than a minute. Before we talk about how we use that information, I'll describe how you most easily determine that abeam position. If the holding fix is an NDB, then you're looking for when the ADF needle is at 90 degrees to the inbound and outbound tracks. This is most easily achieved if you have an HSI and set it to the inbound track, as you have to do no arithmetic, just look for the right angle. Failing that, you need to calculate the 90 degrees on the RMI, if you have one, or by overlaying on the DGI otherwise. If the holding fix is a VOR, just watch for the from flag to go to 2. That works equally well on an OBS as an HSI. If the holding fix is a GNSS waypoint, there are a variety of ways of doing it depending on your equipment, but the most consistent and reliable is also to look at the from to flag on the OBS HSI or on the GNSS display itself, which behaves the same as on the VOR, though more crisply and precisely. So we have a way to know when we're abeam. Remember that in all these discussions, we're talking about how far the wind moves the aircraft in 1 minute, then multiplying it by 3 to know the effect on the first 3 minutes of the hold. So, knowing the timing to the abeam position after the first minute allows us to make corrections for the next 2 minutes. If it takes 1 minute 15 seconds to get to the abeam position, then the first quarter of the hold has already had 15 seconds added. We now need to add 15 seconds to each of the second and third quarters, so we go outbound for 1 minute 30 seconds. Similarly, if we go abeam after 45 seconds, that's 15 seconds early, so we need to subtract 2 lots of 15, 30, from the outbound. So we go out 1 minute minus 30 seconds equals 30 seconds. This does get confusing for people who haven't really thought through what we're doing, because I keep talking about 3 times the correction, and now I'm adding twice the correction. But that is because the first of the 3 has already happened as we're making the measurement. A time correction is only required for 2 of the remaining legs, the outbound leg and the inbound turn. The timing for the leg inbound to the fix doesn't affect the shape of the hold. Conversely, drift needs to be accounted for on the first 3 legs of the hold. It's applied to the outbound leg in order to put you roughly the correct place to commence the inbound turn, which ideally should only need application of single drift. If that's not completely clear, please rewind a couple of minutes and go through it again. You do need to understand why you're doubling it to get 3 times the correction. Although that's taken a long time to explain, once you've got it, it's really simple to execute. This is important because, as I said before, you want a minimum of brain power to go into executing the hold, so that as much as possible is dedicated to the reason you're holding. Just a word for what to do if you forget to start the stopwatch, or, much more common in my experience with students and qualified pilots alike, mess up the buttonology on the stopwatch and then see that it's showing nothing useful. If there's either a DME at the holding fix or you're holding on a GNSS waypoint, if you start the inbound turn at 2.5 to 3 nautical miles, you won't go far wrong. Make it 2.5 in a slower aircraft where the wind is blowing you away from the holding fix, and 3 nautical miles in a faster aircraft where the wind is blowing you towards the fix, somewhere in between for in-between cases. If there's no distance shown, you just have to do it by feel and try and do better the next time round. Remember that once you've worked out the headings and timings, you have whole minutes at a time with nothing to do but hold an attitude. You can spend 5 seconds getting into a rate 1 turn or straight and level on the heading, and you then have 55 seconds to think about fuel planning, getting the gear down, or whatever. So, to summarize, there are 4 steps. 1. Set the HSI to the inbound track so you remain orientated and have an easy visual reference. 2. Arrange your flight so you can measure, that's measure, not calculate, the single drift, and enter the holding fix on the axis of the hold. 3. Time the outbound turn to a beam the holding fix, double the difference from 1 minute, and add or subtract that from the outbound leg. 4. Use 3 times the single drift on the outbound leg. So you're separately measuring the drift across and along the hold and multiplying them up for the perfect hold. But actually, it will never be perfect, which is why I'm going to leave you with one last bit of advice. All these calculations are a bit rough and ready. Nothing is perfect. Errors will creep in. So the tip is always to ensure that those errors work to your advantage. And it's always to your advantage to be further away from the holding fix because it gives you more time and distance to establish properly on the inbound leg. You really don't want to fly through the inbound track, and you don't want to be so close that you never sort out the inbound tracking properly. So when you calculate the outbound track, just add a little fudge factor of say 5 or 10 degrees away from the axis. And when you get the time of beam and double the wind factor, just add 10 or 15 seconds to get you further from the fix. Just don't tell anyone our little secret. I hope this video has helped you with your holding. Practice this on the sim until it's second nature. See you in the next video.